I'm Miriam Golden. I'm here to introduce our speaker for today. Thank you. I want to, remind you that you are muted and that the speaker will speak for about 45 minutes and then we'll take questions. She would love to see you. If you're able to turn on your cameras, it's more fun for her than looking at black boxes. The event is being recorded and the recording will be available online subject to no technical difficulties. So I'm very happy to introduce Alex Escako, who will be speaking about a very complicated long-term migration project that she's been working on, where the data challenges here have to do largely with trying to reach very difficult to reach populations that are actually migrating while the research is going on. And so Alex is a specialist in African politics and has done a lot of randomized control trials in Africa, and also works with me on the COVID-19 Model Challenges project. So it's a great pleasure to welcome her. And Alex, take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Miriam. Thank you guys for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this. Let me just share my screen quickly. Okay, can you see and hear me? Fantastic. Okay, great. So I'm gonna just keep an eye on the time. All right, so I'm really looking forward to getting to talk to you guys about, as Miriam said, a very long-term project that's already been going on for 5 years now. And this is, I am not a data scientist. I study political behavior, mostly in Africa, as Miriam said, and I'm particularly interested in decision-making under highly stressful conditions. So decisions that are fraught with risk. Should I decide to try to migrate through the desert? Should I join that intergroup conflict that's going on around the corner? So anyway, I'm very much looking forward to your feedback. Welcome any and all questions. Okay, so the motivation for this work has to do with a kind of very hot topic politically. And I should say at the outset that, you know, the ethics of the project are nuanced and complicated, and is something that we've given a lot of thought to. So also very happy to talk about research ethics at any point. And I should say that today I'm going to talk about work that is joint, but different pieces are joint with different people. So I'll sort of make that clear as I go along. Okay, so many of you are probably aware that there, in the past decade and a half, there has been a great amount of irregular migration. So migration that's not through sort of regular channels from sub-Saharan Africa to Europe. And here I'm focusing on the West African context and what's called the Mediterranean or Central Mediterranean route, which sort of sounds really great, the Mediterranean route, but is actually an incredibly dangerous and difficult and exploitative sort of migration route that we'll talk about in detail. A lot of projections suggest that irregular migration from West Africa is going to continue, possibly even increase. And interestingly, while there was a kind of brief dip in interest in and attempts at irregular migration in the region, by the end of 2020, it had already bounced back in spite of COVID to sort of pre-COVID levels. So Europe has obviously noticed this, and European governments have put a lot of resources into trying to curtail outmigration from Africa to Europe. And so even countries like Germany that were relatively welcoming during, say, the Syrian refugee crisis have made it extremely difficult to migrate legally from sub-Saharan Africa. And so, you know, as this kind of irregular migration has continued and increased, there's been an absolute explosion of kind of information campaigns trying to reach people at the point of origin, sort of really frankly to discourage irregular migration attempts, focusing on how risky the journey is in some cases focusing on, you know, supposedly limited benefits of actually, if you actually make it to Europe. And then, so this has been going on now for well over a decade, these information campaigns. And in the last few years, there's been a shift also to kind of interventions that provide development assistance to kind of sender countries. So you have sort of pay to stay programs, is what they're called kind of informally, to really try and get in there and deeply shift the cost benefit calculus. So to date, we have very limited evidence on whether or not these interventions succeed on their own terms. So there's very little evaluation work here. And there's almost no evaluation that looks at sort of representative samples in sender contexts. And also, we know very little about what potential migrants actually believe before they decide, or while they're trying to decide to make this kind of super risky journey. So a lot of what I'll be telling you today is sort of detailed original data from a representative sample from a migration hotspot, and actually trying to find out, people who haven't left, what do they think the risks are? And what do they think the benefits are if they do actually reach Europe? So the questions here: what do people in an irregular migration hotspot believe about the process of migrating to Europe? What do they believe their life would be like if they actually reached Europe? And then in the latter part of the talk, I'll ask, what is the impact of providing as accurate as possible information about actual risks of the journey on migration intentions, but also eventually we want to show, are there impacts on actual migration decisions, which is harder to measure for reasons that Miriam hinted at, that, you know, tracking people is very difficult. Okay, so I'll start from pre-intervention survey insights about expectations and beliefs about the journey and about Europe. And then I'll show you some immediate term results and some very new midline results on the impact of an information-based RCT. Okay, just to preview though what's coming. So what we've learned is that in kind of the epicenter of attempts to irregularly migrate from Nigeria, people are better informed about what life is like in European countries than is often assumed. So there's a kind of, there's a website that the German government puts out called Rumors About Germany. And it's really targeted at potential migrants in Africa, actually. And there are lots of, you know, these are rumors you might have heard about Germany. And the rumors are things like, every refugee who arrives in Germany gets a car. Every refugee who arrives in Germany gets their own apartment. And I can say definitively, people in Nigeria do not think this is the case. This is not why they're potentially wanting to migrate to Europe. They don't have wildly unrealistic expectations. They're in fact very savvy about things like the Italian economy. So they are, however, relatively poorly informed. So they're less well informed than we would have guessed about the actual components and nuts and bolts of the migration journey. And they seem very uncertain about the risks. And this is fascinating to us because many people have already migrated from this context. So there are a lot of things I'd love to chat about later, you know, why there might actually be misinformation or poor information in a setting like this about the journey itself. We see evidence of what we might think of as motivated reasoning. So people are much more optimistic about their own chances of migrating successfully than they are about Nigerians' chances overall. And then we find some preliminary evidence for beliefs and interest in the journey that people are responsive to information. Okay, so get into it now. So the existing research on this is not great. It's not, I mean, it's not that it's not good quality, but there's just not that much of it. It's tough to identify and track potential migrants, and it's ethically very complex. So in our RCT, as we'll talk about later, we actually decided only to provide information about the risks of the journey, because as you'll see in our preliminary survey, we found that people, if anything, underestimated the economic benefits of Europe. And given the extreme risks, so very few people actually survive the desert and the sea. It's an enormously risky journey. we were getting lots of ethical questions, and we ourselves were really worried about accidentally encouraging people to go, into the hands of a trafficker across the Saharan desert. So it's a really complex thing to study, in my opinion. And I'm not actually a migration scholar initially. This is a relatively new, quote unquote, kind of topic for me. I come at this as someone who's interested in kind of high risk behavior. Okay, so there's some really interesting, but not many, RCTs that look at migration decisions themselves. So a famous study by Bryan et al., for example, provided bus fares to potential migrants in rural areas during the lean agricultural season to see if they could encourage people to move to the cities, to the city, a nearby city in Bangladesh. And it turned out, at least in this first small scale study that they did, that they were able to encourage this and that it was economically beneficial. And in a kind of beautifully designed study by Beam et al., a large scale sample, about 5,000 people, I believe, they provided a lot of information about how to legally emigrate from the Philippines and kind of how to cut the bureaucratic red tape. And they found incredibly nicely powered, very precisely estimated null effects on everything. None of their interventions had any effect on sort of any legal migration decisions. And shifting to irregular migration, there's sort of even less going on. There's some, I know, very recent work that's starting to be developed, including a lab in the field experimental work by Ban Batista, who asked about hypothetical scenarios and hypothetical rewards and irregular migration. And then a big project by IOM that uses migrant returnees, and they sort of give testimonials about what happened to them on the journey. So people who didn't make it to Europe but were repatriated to Nigeria, for example, or wait, no, I think there's in Senegal, yeah, to Senegal, and they share their experiences, and does that have any effect? And they look at kind of self-expressed interest in migration, but not actually at migration itself. Okay, so there are lots of examples of attempts by European countries to give messages to sending countries. I think one of the most infamous examples, which is not this, is that the Danish government took out a bunch of full-page ads in Lebanese newspapers, actually, talking about, look, you think you might come to Denmark, you think that we're a welfare state, but actually social welfare benefits are on the decline. So that, received a lot of notice, obviously. This one is a little more subtle. So this is in Afghanistan. And this sign says, are you thinking of leaving Afghanistan? Are you sure? So it's a little more subtle. It sort of tries to throw some uncertainty into the decision. Just quickly, this is like, I'm sure for data science people, this is terrible. This is information from the State Department that has way too much going on. But this is just this shows you arrivals to Spain and Italy in particular from 2016 to 2017. So the larger circles represent more arrivals. And it's not surprising that the Nigerian circle is really large. It's by far the most populous country in sub-Saharan Africa, and West Africa has geographic proximity to Europe. And on the bottom, you see kind of asylum applications. So this data covers the period of 2011 to 2017, and Nigeria has far and away the most applications filed. And about 1 in 4 applications are accepted, which sounds very high, but actually, very few people actually make it to the point where they are applying for asylum, unfortunately. Okay, so this is a little bit to understand why we're studying this in Nigeria in the beginning. Okay, so before I started properly studying migration, I would always kind of say, oh, migration scholars always say the same thing, migration is a networked process. What does that mean? Migration is a networked process. Well, now that I study migration, I really agree with them. Nigeria is really vast. And so we know that it is it sends the most attempted irregular migrants to Europe, but where in the country should we be studying this? And it turns out that it's incredibly concentrated. So this is data from a survey conducted in Germany, actually, so it's called the Survey of Refugees, but it's really migrants as well, who actually made it to Germany. And here this is a small number of people. So this is only 65 people here who are actually in, who are Nigerian, who are in the survey. But with this in mind, with this 65 people, more than half come from one state, Edo state, which is where we do our research. And then the next largest group come from neighboring Delta state. So this is a phenomenon. These attempts are really coming from one part of the country, the South-South region. And in fact, they're disproportionately coming from the capital city of Edo State, Benin City. So you see, when we started trying to figure out where should we study this, we saw lots of kind of news coverage that was focusing on Edo and Benin City. And so it's kind of qualitatively understood that this is a big sending context. And so, of course, like many things, the reason why there's so much interest in this one particular setting is very much overdetermined. There's a bunch of things going on. So it's a region where the main kind of industry, rubber production, collapsed a few decades ago. So there aren't a huge amount of economic opportunities. It's also a relatively highly educated population. So kind of in our own surveys, the kind of mean education level is actually a high school degree. So people are quite educated and not and underemployed. There's also a kind of story that you always hear when you go to Benin and you do research on this topic about this kind of infamous chartered flight from Benin to Italy in the 1980s, full of women who were supposedly being flown to go and do agricultural work, but actually wound up being employed in sex work. So it's this kind of thing that happened in the 80s and sort of snowballed from there. And then, once something like this gets started, the fact that migration is such a networked process just really snowballs this. And it's useful for traffickers, frankly, that they benefit from economies of scale. So there are a lot of forces kind of moving in the same direction. Okay, so what do we want to know? We want to know beliefs about risks, costs, and benefits of migration to Europe. This was because we're interested in it, but also because this would inform information-based RCT design. So we sampled 500 Benin City residents in a particularly vulnerable age group. So younger people are more likely to engage in this kind of irregular migration than old people, not that surprisingly. And we understood qualitatively that both men and women are about equally likely to try this journey. So this is not like some settings. I know, for example, in Gambia, it's an overwhelmingly male kind of migration process. That's not the case in Nigeria. Okay, so kind of on the data side, so Nigeria is a kind of difficult context to do large-scale systematic research because there's no reliable census data. So the last sort of reliable census is kind of generally believed to be a census from 1963. So you're very often like working in the dark. And so in order to try to come up with a sampling frame, we actually worked with a group of wonderful research assistants to actually geolocate using satellite imagery to geolocate every physical structure in the Benin City metropolitan area. And we used building density as a proxy for poverty. So this shows the whole of Benin City divided into neighborhoods, existing neighborhoods, and the red areas are more dense. They have more buildings, like more densely populated buildings, and the green areas are less densely populated. So we oversampled from dense areas based on a bunch of qualitative interviewing that we did that suggested that poorer parts of the city were more likely to be hotspots for irregular migration. Okay, so what did we actually find in just a very top level before we get into beliefs and expectations? We found that it is certainly true that you can do a random sample and come up with a lot of people who are interested in potentially irregularly migrating. So about a quarter, this is unweighted proportion of households, about a quarter had someone who left to follow land, which is a euphemism for irregular migration along the Mediterranean route, in the previous year. So this survey was conducted in 2018. So this is in the previous year in 2017. 1/3 of respondents in the survey say they have a family member abroad already who kind of traveled the back way, traveled by routes. And about a quarter of men and a fifth of women are interested a lot or a fair amount in following land. And this question we had people fill in themselves on a tablet just to try to get around possible desirability bias of, asking someone and then having them respond to this out loud. So people are really interested in this. Okay, so now really into the meat of things. So before leaving, what did this set of potential migrants actually believe that life in Europe would be like? And so we asked incentivized questions. So for each question that that respondents answered in the top half of the sample of responses, they would receive 50 naira, which is about 12 cents, 12 US cents. And so first of all, so in the top left panel, we asked them, what's your best guess of the monthly income? So monthly income in the EU. And so I'm showing this in thousands of euros, but we asked the question in Nigerian naira, which is the local currency. So people are used to thinking about that. And I should say for all of these histograms, the red dashed line represents the correct answer. So the nice thing about asking questions about the European economy is that you can kind of verify them. Okay, so what do we see? Just quickly glancing at these red dashed lines, we see that if anything, respondents in this part of Nigeria actually underestimate things like monthly income. I mean, what we mostly see is they're actually fairly accurate. I should say that first. So first of all, look at the top right here. We asked, what's the best guess for life expectancy in Europe? And the mean is right on target here at 80 years old. And you might think, oh, this is just sort of obvious, or this is focal. The life expectancy in Nigeria is much lower. It's actually on average for men and women about 53 years old. So it's quite different. Okay, so you can see here that most of the distribution in the top left, for example, look at this histogram, most of the distribution is kind of to the left of the dotted line. So people are underestimating, if anything. This is also quite true for when we asked, again, incentivized to guess monthly unemployment benefits in Italy. Also here reflected in thousands of euros, people were, relatively underestimating how much they would actually get. And then we're quite accurate about monthly unemployment benefits in the UK. So by the way, feel free to I don't know if this is against the norms, but if people do have questions about anything that's burning, feel free to ask me. Okay, so this is more accurate and more conservative than we expected. Nobody thinks that kind of the Italian streets are paved with gold. Okay, now we shift to questions about beliefs about the journey itself. So here you notice there are no red dashed lines, and this is because we don't really know the correct answer for sure. We have, we can triangulate different sources of information, which is what we do in the information RCT, but this is not something we can verify. So these are not incentivized, but I still think it's really interesting and we can learn something from this. So now we asked questions about, imagine 100 people.
Alex?
Oh yeah, Miriam.
I'm going to interrupt because there is a question that is just factual that needs to be answered now.
Great.
What is the scale of salaries on the horizontal axis? And do you know the average guess about salaries in Europe generally?
Oh, like what Europeans would guess? That's a great question. I've actually never been asked that. Thanks. I don't know what Europeans would guess, but that's such a great idea. We should find out. Hold on one sec. Yes. So the scale is on thousands of euros. So basically in the top left, you can see that the correct answer for monthly income per capita in the EU is a bit under 2.9, so 2,900 euros. Sorry for that. But that's a great point. Thank you to whomever made it about seeing how Europeans measure this. Also, something that I often get asked at this point in presenting this work is, so are people thinking about Europeans when they answer this question? Are they thinking about themselves? And I will say that if I have time, I'll get to that because we have some other data from the survey that can kind of get at that a little bit, where we compare anyway, I'll get to that later. But we just asked in a very general way. In our baseline for the RCT, which we collected a few years later, we actually specifically ask about Nigerians, but here they're just thinking about anyone. Okay. So onto the journey itself. So a couple of things stand out. So again, these are not incentivized. These are hypothetical questions. We said sort of imagine 100 people from your community in Nigeria. How many of them do you think would experience, out of 100, would experience the following things if they tried to go by land to Europe? So would they be injured, killed, encounter sexual abuse, encounter slavery? And these are, real things that happen quite frequently along this like very exploitative migration route. And so to me, a couple of things stand out here. First of all, they're flatter distributions than we saw here. And you see a lot of spikes at 50 out of 100, which is kind of like a focal number. And so to me, one interpretation of this is that people are just relatively uncertain. They have a vague sense that this is dangerous, but they're not kind of concentrating right around anything aside from sort of 50 out of 100. And then if you look at the other values, they're relatively equal to each other for the most part. And so this suggests to us that people kind of know it's dangerous, but they're not really sure how dangerous, and certainly not sure how dangerous, what are the specific risks of different types of abusive things happening. Okay, another way to get at this, aside from kind of these hypotheticals about 100 people similar to you, are to just ask concrete questions about the nuts and bolts of what the standard Central Med route migration experience is. So certainly in 2018, when we conducted this survey, I mean, just the overwhelming number of people who try this in a very kind of standardized way. So the first question is, okay, on the route, how do most people cross into Niger? And so we know that the answer to this is actually by motorbike. So it's a desert border between northern Nigeria and Niger, and people ride on the back of commercial motorbikes across the border. And as you can see, very few people actually knew that the correct answer is bike. And kind of remarkably, we had an other option that people could fill in their own answer. And a non-trivial number of people said that you do this by boat, which is definitely impossible because there is no water at that, anywhere nearby where the kind of migration route happens. So people don't really know that many specifics about this. We also asked a question without priming this. We said, what's the place in Niger where people are transferred to kind of these sort of, you may have seen pictures of this in the media, sort of these white pickup trucks where people are really, overly squished in for the journey. So some people did know that Agadez is like the big transfer point, but most people didn't actually know this. So this suggests again that people vaguely understand this is dangerous, but they don't have as much specific knowledge as one might expect, given how much migration happens out of this area. And then finally, just I had mentioned before that we see some evidence of the possibility of motivated reasoning. So people are really, they really want to leave Nigeria, they really want to reach Europe, and they overestimate their own chances of actually making it all the way. So we asked, if you tried this, how likely do you think it is that you'd be able to go all the way to Europe? And the overwhelming majority of people think it's very likely or somewhat likely. And then, if you were to reach Europe, how likely is it that you think that you would be granted asylum? And again, you see a lot of optimism. Now, of course, we can't tell for any given individual if this is correct, but on average, right, people are very confident compared to what the numbers that we know of in real life suggest. Okay, so just to kind of wind up that part of the talk. So potential migrants in like the epicenter of Nigerian irregular migration to Europe are better informed about destination contexts than many people, for example, the people who wrote the Rumors About Germany website assume. They seem to be relatively poorly informed about features of the migration journey, and they seem to be disproportionately optimistic about their own chances of migrating. So I'm super excited in the Q&A to dive into more of this and really look forward to questions and all that. But just in the interest of time. So this is now a project with a broader group of researchers, including Bernd Weber, McCartan Humphreys, and Dean Yang. And so kind of based on this initial survey work that Bernd Weber and I did, we started working with this group on designing kind of an RCT that's information-based. And so our target was a study size of 3,000 people, age 18 to 39, representative of Edo and Delta states. So a much broader sort of swath of territory. And we followed the same process to come up with a sampling frame in the absence of any real usable data. So we geolocated, again, with a team of RAs, more than 900,000 structures across these two states. And we look both in rural and urban areas. So, okay, so what is the key treatment? And I'm actually going to show you the script in a minute. So we targeted information at households. So we randomly sampled, so we've got a primary sampling unit, we randomly sampled households, and then we randomly sampled individual respondents within a household. But when we came to the point of giving this information treatment, we actually asked anyone in the household who was there if they would come and sit and listen to something for a few minutes, because migration is, even in a place like this, relatively rare. So we wanted to treat as many people as possible. So we provide kind of information from a bunch of different sources in a factual script that talks about injury, death, the chances of reaching Europe at all, the chances of getting to stay there. And then after a more facts-based kind of bunch of content, we show respondents a small video with testimonials from actual migrant returnees about their experience on the Med route from Nigeria through Niger and possibly Libya. Okay, and so roughly 6 months and roughly 12 months later, we then go back, we measure interest in migration, irregular migration, beliefs, so the same sets of questions about estimated risks. And then, because of the fact that in this setting, households typically do not migrate as a whole, but it's typically one person or 2 people who try this, we actually go back to the households and take sort of detailed household rosters. So we have household rosters both pre and post, so baseline and midline and endline. I'll get into this a bit more later. Okay, so one thing that we actually did in this treatment is that we used the information about motivated reasoning that we got in the 2018 survey to show people this kind of motivated reasoning. So we show them, this is our best estimates of the actual risks. And this is what people in a survey, of a community like yours actually thought the risks look like. So yeah, we have facts, we have this motivated reasoning exercise, and then we do a lot of things to try to measure that respondents are paying attention and are engaged with the material. So the overall treatment of all the different parts takes about 15 minutes. So the strategy here is to try a lot of different things. We're not at the stage in this research program where we're like subtly looking for tweaks in language or this or that, but to see, let's say you give a ton of information to a lot of people, you bring everyone together in the household, does this have any effect on beliefs, interest in trying this, and then actual migration? Okay, so this is way too much text. I'm just going to read you a few snippets, but so you get the kind of general idea. So now we want to share some important information with you. So this is, 50% were randomly assigned to receive this treatment. 50% did not receive it. All the information we will tell you is true. We're not telling you what to do, and we're not from the government. Most Nigerians who leave to go to Europe travel across the Sahara and the Mediterranean Sea. The passage usually lasts at least several weeks, but sometimes lasts many months. There's a risk of being injured or dying along the route. Note that we're not giving specific percentages here because we don't have that fine-grained information. We don't want to mislead people. Most people think it would be different for them, and they would be able to make it, but that is not the case. Many people die, including people like you. We don't know exactly how many people, and one reason is that the bodies of those who drown at the sea or are left behind in the desert are often not found. Okay, so a bunch more information. We talk about different things that can happen. Some people are forced to sell sex, sold into slavery, or killed, especially if they can't pay extra money along the route or if they get sick. So we did about 30 hours of qualitative interviews with migrant returnees and learned that it's extraordinarily, unbelievably exploitative process, the actual route. And I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A. Right now, many, many thousands of Nigerians are stuck in Libya because they have not been able to cross the Mediterranean Sea. So in 2020, embassy estimates suggested that about 100,000 Nigerians are currently stranded in kind of unspeakable prison conditions in Libya, and as many as 1 million maybe from across all different West African countries. Okay. So some more stuff. We estimate about 200,000 Nigerians attempted to reach Europe in 2018. About 20,000 complete the journey every year. But most Nigerians that make it to Europe are not allowed to stay and are sent back. And only 1 out of every 4 Nigerian applicants was successful in their asylum application between 2011 and 2017. Okay, now moving on to the motivated reasoning exercise, we want you to see a picture that shows how many Nigerians that follow land actually make it to Europe. Here, each figure represents 1,000 women and men who try to follow land. Remember, we estimate about 200,000 Nigerians attempted to follow land, so there are 200 of these human figures. Orange and blue represent people that reach Europe. Blue are those who are accepted. As you can see, the vast majority of people never reach Europe. These people are represented by the black shapes. So this is the picture based on all of the best kind of information that we had available to us about kind of what the odds are of actually reaching Europe and then being able to stay. So the blue figures represent how many people reach Europe and are actually granted asylum. And then we kind of have a bunch of questions, making sure that people are engaged and are understanding what we're talking about with all of these strange shapes. Okay, now you might think this wouldn't happen to you. You might think that you personally would not be hurt along the route. Okay, so here's another picture. It uses the same layout and colors as the previous one, but now it shows what people from around here think will happen. And so this is what people think will happen, right? If we take their expectations of what would happen to them that I showed you from the 2018 survey in Benin City. So the kind of contrast that we're going for is this image versus this image. And then after this kind of facts-based, this sort of treatment, motivated reasoning exercise, then we show about a slightly under 6-minute video of kind of publicly available news clippings about people talking about what happened to them when they tried the journey. Okay, so what happened? So just to give some context, we very conveniently started our baseline survey in March 2020. So we were able to do about 1/3 of the surveying in March 2020 before getting shut down. And then we were able to resume work in November 2020. So this here is pooled between March 2020 and December 2020. So we have just really quickly, this is not the ultimate goal, but this is a sort of reality check to see if any of this made any sense to anyone. We asked people in that self-administered style where they would take the tablet and write in the response themselves. We asked pre and post intervention for treated respondents about whether they were interested in trying this themselves. And so this reflects beginning of survey versus end of same survey. Do people have any shift in self-reported but self-expressed interest in migrating? And you can see that there's a bit of a dip in the control, and there's a much steeper dip in treated respondents. So there's about an 8% difference. And this is very significant if anyone cares about that at the kind of standard 99% level. So yeah, immediately people expressed less interest. So one thing that is kind of interesting. So instead of thinking about this kind of intensive margin, you might say, what about the extensive margin? Like, you know, what, like more in a more detailed way, rather than just thinking of, yes, I'm interested, or no, I'm not interested. So all of these sort of blue options here are different versions of yes. And what you can see if you look here, say, so for example, look at this bottom square that said they were pre-treatment, said they were very interested. I'm interested a lot in trying this. You can see that most of the action is shifting people not from I'm a lot interested to I'm a little interested, but it's in shifting people from I'm a lot interested to I'm not interested at all. There's a little bit of the former, but most of the action is just you're either interested in this or not. And so you can see that, right? Pre-treatment, 76% said they weren't at all interested, and post 86%. Okay, fine. Like we just spent like 15, 20 minutes like providing a ton of information about this. You know, as a just kind of very basic first step, does it have any effect at all on baseline? Okay, so now what about at midline? So I should say we're actually currently finishing up our endline data collection now. We're almost completely done. And so we did midline approximately 6 months after baseline, although because of COVID and things being complicated, it's really a range of more like 6 to 8 months after. And remember before that it had about an 8% reduction immediately. So this is 6 to 8 months later. Now we asked again in a same self-administered way, how interested are you in trying this irregular migration? And we see that we still do find, again, for what it's worth, conventionally significant results, and the effect is a lot smaller. It's a bit more than half smaller. Now we see treatment effects of about 4% as opposed to 8%, but kind of shocking to me, if I'm being perfectly honest, that this persisted in any way. Okay, so that's self-expressed interest. Now let's turn to beliefs, sort of what we are mostly talking about in the presentation up till now. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'll try to be judicious. Okay, so here we have the control group mean is, remember, this is that question again, out of 100 people, you know, how many men do you think will be injured, will die, et cetera, et cetera. And what this top row here, treatment, suggests is that, okay, people who were treated in the immediate effects, so this is the end of the baseline survey itself, thought that about 15 more people were injured, 14 more people died. So these are really large substantive effects, and these are all, you know, highly, highly significant. So it has, you know, if you were in the control group, you thought 39 out of 100 were injured. If you were in the treatment, you thought whatever 39 plus 15 is. So it's, you know, quite large and pretty comparable when asking questions about hypothetical women who attempted to make the journey. Okay, so now quickly, before I totally run out of time, what about 6 to 8 months later? So going back, following up, we see that here we still have generally sort of significant results. They're about 1/3 of the size now as they were in the immediate. So before, you know, you had a shift of say 15 people for injury. Now you have a shift of about 5 people. So again, I was kind of amazed that, frankly, that this persisted for such a long time. And we see very similar things for the questions that are asked about men and women. Okay, so now the big question, of course, is does this have an effect on actual migration decisions? And I wish that we were far enough along that I could give you a definitive answer, but the answer is we're working on it right now. So we were able to find, so this is just attrition. We're not even getting into, you know, specifically what we know about where people are and where they tried to go, et cetera, yet. You know, doing a midline in this setting, especially during COVID, is a little bit challenging. And so this is our first attempt at midline we did over the phone, kind of trying to make sure that this was safe. And then we did a follow-up. So we were able to find like 65% of people, no problem on the phone. And then we were able to find another kind of 15% through in-person follow-ups once it was safe to do so. So it's actually not that dangerous right now in terms of COVID in Nigeria. And so here, so this is just with the phone. So we'll have more expansive stuff to talk about, hopefully very soon. But we see that people who were treated were about 3% less likely to have attrited from the study. But what we do is, again, since if we can't find the particular respondent, we then talk to household members, we talk to neighbors, we talk to friends, we talk to as many people as possible. So hopefully within the next few weeks, we will have a sense of whether this is just something that shifts beliefs and self-expressed migration intentions, or if this actually has an effect on migration itself. So I have no idea yet, and we will see. Okay, so right now we're going through, the kind of detailed work of tracking each particular respondent and each particular household to try and find out where they are. Did they try to leave? Did they wind up somewhere else? And we're, days away from being done with our end-line data collection. And because we actually did move, we believe that we did move kind of attitudes and beliefs, we decided to do one other experiment, which is just a decomposition experiment. So we took this big bundled, very long treatment, and we chopped it up into 3 different small treatments that were delivered via WhatsApp or SMS. One that focuses on the facts, one that focuses on the facts and the motivated reasoning exercise, and then one that just has the more emotional content about kind of people's really difficult personal testimonials. So again, relatively soon, hopefully in a matter of weeks, once all of the end-line data is collected, we'll be able to look at, were there different parts of this that resonated more with people. Okay, sorry that I went over. Very much looking forward to your questions.
Alex, thank you so much. That's fascinating. We already have a lot of questions in the chat. Okay. So I want to start with one, but if you have a question, could you raise your hand, raise your yellow hand so that it goes into the participant list and I can call on you. But the first question that I'm going to just read out is from, I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, Yahia. And she wants to know about the, she wants to know about the ethics of doing satellite, which she says satellite tracking of an entire city. Oh. Would this be legal in Europe for similar research on migration? So I think you weren't doing satellite tracking. And so maybe you want to explain again what you did.
Yeah, sorry about that. That's so.
Yeah, hi, sorry. I think I used the wrong word. I know that you said geolocation, right?
Yes.
Yes. So mapping all the physical structures in a city, is that something that is, what was the ethics that you felt about doing that? And would that be legal in a European city?
Wow. I mean, Germans are very, very pro data protection. So that's an excellent question. It's possible that that wouldn't be. I think a lot of people don't like Google Maps, for example. But that's so interesting because there's so many kind of really stressful ethical things about this project. Something that I should have said at the beginning, by the way, is that like the full group of researchers think that the best Europe is a diverse Europe, and we are, not in any way politically anti-migration at all. But this is just a really horrifying, very dangerous route. But I don't know, that's a great question. So, we use satellite images really just as a count, right? So we counted basically just to count the number of buildings. I don't know that, we were zooming in enough that we would really learn anything super interesting about what was going on in these different buildings. This was very kind of zoomed out. But it's an excellent question, and I guess I have to think about that because I don't have a great answer.
I have to say, as a member of the ethics committee at the EUI, I don't think there would be any problem with this at all. It's not personally identifying information in any way. You're inventorying buildings,
right?
And so I don't think it would have ethical implications.
The biggest challenge was just how inaccurate it was, in the sense that we were able to know the number of structures, but many of them were abandoned or like partially completed buildings. So I don't know if let me just see. I know I don't have a ton of time, but let me share my screen again and see if I actually have that as a backup slide. I may totally not, but Oh yeah, ethical research. I have this. No, these are like qualitative. No, I guess I don't have it. Sorry. So we have like some nice photos from the field of sort of, you know, one thing that happens is if you're one of the few people who actually makes it to Europe, it's like it not only kind of economically extremely beneficial, but it's very high status kind of situation. So people will buy land with, you know, income from Europe and like stake out a building, but you see this incredible landscape around Benin City and in other cities in the region of just semi-completed buildings. So we had a really difficult time with the enumeration of like, you have to go to so many buildings before you actually reach an inhabited building. But thank you for asking that. That's interesting, and I'll think more about it.
The next question is from Julia. And now I see people putting their hands up. Thank you. So we only have we only have 9 minutes. So
Okay.
Julia, do you want to read your question out if you're still here? Julia may have left, so we're
Okay,
just
sorry about that. I see. So these are questions in the chat, which I did
some
not see.
questions in the chat, right? So let me take a question in almost real life. Camila.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, because my connection is so well. So thank you so much for the presentation. I also quite curious about maybe other questions that maybe the survey contains in terms of social capital and gender perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering whether, for instance, if does in sort of way have any effect having relatives of friends in the receiving country,
Mm-hmm.
and whether having this information from their relatives or friends in this receiving country might have kind of a mechanism effect or
Mm-hmm.
controlling part of the survey, because I remember that you said at the beginning that a part of the population, part of the sample does have some kind of connections with the potential country, but that is something that also was not 100% sure how, if you is part also the social capital part of your the research, or to what extent?
One piece of that, so that's an excellent question. One piece of that is like, what puzzled me a bit was like why people seem so uncertain about the risks of the journey and various nuts and bolts of the journey, when supposedly like 1 out of 4 households have had people try this. And so of course, one of the first sort of definitely pre-registered, of course, like heterogeneous effects we wanted to look at is, you know, do you see differences in beliefs from people living in households that have a member abroad or don't? And there's some exceptions, but for the most part, there's not much going on. And so, you know, this makes me think of a potentially like just very emotional anti-migration, frankly, ad that I saw in the UK. And it's about kind of the pressures to misrepresent for people, even the people who are really successful and arrive. And so what it shows is a young African woman. She's in a British city, maybe London, and she is, you know, they show her in a basement apartment, and it's kind of dark and not very beautiful. And she leaves the apartment and she walks out into the pouring rain, and she goes to a telephone booth and she's calling her relatives back home. And, oh, how is everything going? They ask. And she said, oh, everything's great. And, you know, she proceeds to talk about like how terrific her life is after this kind of somewhat emotionally manipulative, I guess, video has shown like how difficult the life is. So one mechanism through which, you know, a lot of prior migration might not lead to perfect information and even misinformation is kind of lots of social and other incentives to not tell the truth, and to kind of try to paint things in a rosier picture. And a lot of chatter among young people who are considering this happens on things like Instagram and Facebook. And we all know that these have a very rosy filter, right? You're not seeing posts from people who are imprisoned in Libya, you're seeing posts from people who made it to southern Italy. So that's one thing. Another thing about this misinformation is that traffickers have every single incentive to spread misinformation. And they do this, we know this qualitatively. Oh yes, you should try this. It only takes a few days, maybe a week if you get really unlucky, and et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know if that's a perfect answer, but this matters a lot less than I thought it would. Let's put it that way.
Thank you. Our next question is from Cecilia.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Alex, for your presentation. I find it very interesting. And yeah, I also study migration campaigns in my PhD, so very relevant.
Amazing.
I just have a question on, I just would like you to reflect a little bit on your positionality as a researcher in doing this, especially how your position as a researcher affects how people welcome or react to the information that you give. So the reliability of your the information that you give, but also how the information that you guys provide is different from other kind of information that people might have access to, right? So you started by speaking about these information campaigns. So I don't know if the people that you survey were also exposed to different kind of campaigns throughout this time when they were surveyed, but also how you think that the information you give them is different from more classic information campaign. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Those are awesome questions, and I'm excited to hear more about your dissertation at some point. Okay, so there's a lot of things in there. So the most kind of ridiculous, easy, lazy answer is that, of course, I personally was not doing any of these interviews because I don't speak the relevant language, but we were very transparent about who the research was funded by. And I think we went even like more than usual over this because we wanted to make it incredibly clear that we weren't partnering with any European governments or any or the Nigerian government, which has its own agenda here. And Europe is putting a ton of pressure on the Nigerian government to like crack down on this. So we made it super clear this is just for research only, and the usual thing of like you can contact us at any time. But I personally wasn't there, and so I imagine that things would have gone differently, I would expect, if I were there in the room. The other question, yeah, so I think a lot of information that people get is through social media and through kind of chats with people who are friends or family who've tried the trip or successfully competed the trip. And so what we're providing is like more aggregate picture of what's going on using statistics from IOM and other institutes, right? So there is something definitely different there. And on the baseline for the RCT, which I have not shown you that information yet, we asked questions about, have you been exposed to information campaigns before? Have you heard testimonials? Because I mean, it became a very hot topic, a very hot thing to do, and all kinds of, not so much researchers, but IOM is really active in this area, as you can imagine. And so there are like community town hall meetings all the time where, just say no to irregular migration and here are the risks. So we can look at whether prior exposure to this information, conditions the effects. My suspicion is that a lot of people have heard something before. But the IOM was really doing a lot of these emotional testimonial style things, not so much factual, and certainly not this like motivated reasoning. So I would suspect that if anything, it's the emotional part that's like less effective because people are already saturated. And hopefully we'll be able to investigate this in our decomposition experiment soon. I think you asked other things, but feel free to follow up if I didn't get to them.
So we have about 30 seconds left.
Oh no.
Let me, and we ended exactly on time.
Okay.
So let me just, Julia's back, but I'm not sure we're going to have time. Let me ask, is there a paper written up yet? And if not, do you know when it will be?
Yeah. So
then when I'm done, Natalia wants to.
Okay, yes. So there's a working paper that's all about the results that I showed you from the 2018 survey about beliefs. It's up on my website. I can share the link with Miriam or someone else and then share it with you guys if you'd like. And then, yes, once we do the analysis of the end line, we are certainly going to write this up, and hopefully it will be published in Science. No, it'll be published somewhere, and I'll put it up on my website.
Natalia, you want to mention next time? Thank you so much. Sorry that we've run out of time for
Sorry,
questions.
guys.
Natalia.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk, Alex. It was super interesting. I just wanted to remind everyone that next time we're going to have Arthur Sprinting from NYU discussing how to study the changing use and meaning of words in different contexts using regression. And this talk will take place on the 23rd. So we're really looking forward to having you all also connecting for the talk. And again, thank you so much, Alex. This has been like super interesting. We've learned a lot for sure. And the conversation, I hope that we're able to have it offline. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye.